Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me. Very happy to be here. So I will introduce myself. The way I would like to introduce myself would be that I'm a conscientious objector to military service, an activist in the joint popular Palestinian struggle, and an activist in the boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign against Israel. But there is also another way to introduce myself, which would be to say that I'm a privileged Israeli Jew. Or more precisely, I'm a white male, privileged white male Israeli Jew. Now, I didn't choose that. The white male part, probably nature or my parents chose, but the Israeli Jewish part is something that the state of Israel chose for me. In my identification card, it says citizenship Israeli, nationality Jewish. My neighbor in Jaffa, their citizenship would be, their identity card would be citizenship Israeli, nationality Arab, for example. Israel recognizes over 130 different nationalities, like you name it, Italian and Dutch and so on, but it does not recognize its own nationality. It's probably the only country in the world that doesn't recognize its own nationality. So inside Israel, we have 4 different nationality groups, as the Ministry of Interior sees it, and none of which are Israeli. Now, that's not just a technicality, that is pretty much at the base of everything that I would like to tell you about today. And I would argue pretty much at the base of everything that is happening in Palestine/Israel. So going back to, not exactly when it started, but the key point in time was the founding of the State of Israel in 1948. At the eve of 48, there were about 30% Jews, ethnic Jews, living on that land, and about 10% of the land was Jewish owned. But according to the UN partition plan, the UN decided to give about 56% of the land to these 30%, who were, by the way, colonizers. They were, many of them came there recently to take over the land and the resources and so on. So that was obviously an unfair decision. But it didn't even have a chance to materialize, because the first thing that happened is that those Zionists who wanted to establish this so-called Jewish and democratic state, it doesn't have a logical meaning. What does it mean to have Jewish and democratic state? Either you have a democracy or you don't have a democracy. But what it meant for them is that in order to have a Jewish democratic state, first they need to have a Jewish majority, and then they can claim that they have a democracy. As long as they control the population, then they can claim that they are democratic. And that's pretty much what has been happening since. First of all, a Jewish majority had to be created, and it was created by force, by sheer force. About 700 or 800,000 people were expelled from their homes. There were also brutal acts of massacre and rapes and so on. But in general, there was a premeditated act of ethnic cleansing. So 800,000 people had been expelled, about 530 villages were being demolished or reoccupied. After creating this artificially created Jewish majority, then the next thing that happened was to put in place a system that would make sure that this majority is maintained, mainly denying those people who have been expelled from there from ever coming back. And secondly, giving privileges to those among the select group that I belong to, and denying the rights, the basic rights of the others, because not everyone was expelled from there. There are, at this moment, about 20% of the population, of the citizens of Israel, who are non-Jewish. Most of them are Palestinian. But they are not equal citizens. They are, at best, second-class citizens. But this was the thinking from the very beginning, from the very foundation of the state. First of all, creating this Jewish majority by force. Secondly, maintaining this and denying the basic rights, or denying equality in every possible way from those who are not wanted, simply because they do not belong to the same group, ethnic group that I belong to. So there were racist laws that were put in place from the very beginning. there was the law of return, trying to counter the right of return. So the law of return says that any ethnic Jew, what the state of Israel deems as a Jew, which has nothing to do with religious aspects, because Zionism is not a religious movement. Israel is not Jewish by religion. Some would argue that it is anti-religious, anti-Jewish. But what Israel deems as a Jew, anyone born in the Netherlands, for example, may come to Israel and get immediate citizenship. On the other hand, a Palestinian who has been living in Palestine for generations, whose family has been there for generations and has been expelled from there, cannot come back, can never come back. Even those who remained in the territory that later became Israel, but have left their homes, they are what we regard as internal refugees. So those who fled Jaffa to Haifa, for example, and have lost the property during the War of 48, have lost the right forever to go back home. They are still Israeli citizens, but they're also internal refugees. And there was a law legislated about that. Later on, every other law, or many other laws, about 50 of them, have basically they were based on these two laws, the law of return and the citizenship law, which are explicitly racist. All these other laws are implicitly racist. They simply say that if a person is eligible under these initial laws, then also the other laws apply to them. So an inherently discriminatory system has been put in place. After that, much later, about 20 years later, also came the brutal occupation of the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem. Now, those territories are under a brutal military regime, military control, and I think that everyone would agree that there is a consensus about it that this brutal occupation has to end. The occupation itself is not illegal under international law, but since this occupation, rather than respecting the rights of the occupied, rather than occupying power, respecting the rights of those who are occupied, they work in order to take away their rights, to violate their basic rights, then this falls under the definition of belligerent occupation, and that is clearly illegal and has to be finished. So there is a consensus about it, that this occupation has to end. And still, this is the longest running military occupation in modern time, since 1967 to this day. Why is this so? The only reason that Israel can carry on with this military occupation, let alone the former occupation of 48 and the ethnic cleansing and so on, is because it doesn't have to pay the price for it. All the powers that be, mainly the US, Canada, the EU, protect Israel in every possible way, and it acts as if it is above the law. It has full impunity in the world. Now, at the same time that Israel acts in this criminal fashion, we see more and more public outcry against these violations of international law and violations of universally recognized human rights by Israel. So going back to this Israeli nationality of mine, inside Israel I have an Israeli citizenship, but as I mentioned, there is no Israeli nationality. My nationality is Jewish. But when I came here, I was using my Israeli passport, and my Israeli passport says nationality Jewish. Says nationality Israeli. That is a lie. There's no such thing. So what happens is that internally, Israel discriminates in every possible way, but outside, it doesn't look good when you recognize people according to their religion or ethnicity or whatever. So outside, it lies to the rest of the world and claims that there is such a thing as an Israeli nationality. Now, to prove my case, there was a group of Israeli Jews, ethnic Jews, who appealed to the Israeli Supreme Court. The Israeli Supreme Court As I mentioned, the whole legal system is a discriminatory one. It can fall under the legal definitions of the crime of apartheid. And that Supreme Court is the one that is legitimizing all this illegitimate practice. So they appeal to the Supreme Court of Israel, requesting that their nationality would be Israeli rather than Jewish, for their reasons, because they don't feel comfortable with having a Jewish nationality written, and they feel that they're Israeli, and they feel that they have a right to be recognized as such. After long deliberations, after this arrived at the Supreme Court and so on, the verdict was obviously that the court cannot acknowledge their request. They cannot acknowledge having an Israeli nationality. And in their decision, they stated that acknowledging such a thing, an Israeli nationality, would undermine the very character of the State of Israel. That was a very correct statement by the Israeli Supreme Court. That, having an Israeli nationality, would mean that at least on paper there is some basis for equality. And that definitely undermines everything that the State of Israel is about. Israel was founded on the basis of, first of all, ethnic cleansing, and then on an ethnic supremacist ideology and practice, which definitely is represented in the Israeli legal system, and probably even more so in the practice. As we know, budgets and allocation of resources and so on by the Israeli government, any Israeli government, doesn't matter who's the prime minister and so on, as being clearly discriminatory. And these racist laws and practices touch on pretty much every aspect of life of Palestinian citizens of Israel, and pretty much anyone who is not Jewish, but especially those Arab citizens of Israel. So, if the case is so clear, and it seems that it is quite clear, if we go back to the decision by the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, from July 2004, they had to decide about the legality of the wall, what's called the annexation wall or the security barrier, and they had to decide about the legality of this. And in order to do that, they also had to decide about whose territory is this, and what is the status of the settlements there, and so on. And the International Court of Justice unanimously decided that the whole of the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem are occupied Palestinian territories. Every single settlement there is illegal, and every kilometer of the wall has to be dismantled. Because the case is very clear under international law. If we look at human rights violations, again, the case is very clear. If you look at all these different reports by a variety of human rights organizations, they say pretty much the same thing. Israel does not regard human rights in the occupied territories. It also violates many of the human rights of the minorities inside Israel proper. One example of what is happening inside Israel proper, or what we call 48, there is the Bedouin minority. Most of them are in the Nakab Desert in the south, and they have been living there since before the foundation of the State of Israel. They've been living there for generations. Now many of them are living in unrecognized villages. These unrecognized villages have no infrastructure, no water, no running water, electricity, sewage system, and so on. Their neighbors, just across the fence, have all these infrastructures. And that is this is due to a legalistic issue, but obviously it's a politically motivated legalistic issue that simply discriminates against them and denies them basic services from the state, even though they are Israeli citizens. Their citizenship is Israeli, but their nationality is not. Is not Jewish, for sure, probably Arab. Recently there was the Praver plan that was discussed in the Israeli government. And that plan aims at confining or removing, relocating about 40,000 people, Bedouin citizens of Israel who live there in the Nakab Desert, to a smaller area just south of the West Bank. I can only imagine what plans they have for this area later in time. But basically the idea is to vacate that space that is currently inhabited by Bedouins in order to allow for the Jewish citizens to live there instead. And this is pretty clear. It isn't stated explicitly, but everyone can understand that that is the rationale behind it. There was some demonstrations around this, and at the moment this plan is on hold. They haven't completely abandoned the plan, but it is on hold. But also, it's very interesting to see the discussion around it. But what is certain is the Israeli government has not abandoned this idea of ethnic cleansing and ethnic supremacy that started at the latest in 1948, but it has just changed the practicalities here. So what started by sheer force in 48 is now being done under the guise of the law. And the Israeli government is simply pushing government plans that are aimed at giving privileges to some by denying the rights of others. So if the situation is so clear, and in July 2004 the ICJ stated that indeed there is no question about, definitely no question about the occupied territories, whose right it is for the territories, over the territories and so on. And if the Powers That Be lend full impunity to Israel, then it only makes sense that we, the people of the world, have to speak up against it. And there was a real opportunity exactly 1 year after the ICJ decision. In July 2005, Palestinian civil society came up with a BDS campaign, the call for boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel. And the call simply states that Israel is obligated under international law and under universally recognized human rights. And there are three fundamental rights of the Palestinians that have to be respected. And until such a time that these fundamental rights are respected, non-violent means of boycott, divestment, and sanctions have to be applied on this criminal occupying apartheid state. What are these rights? So we have the occupied territories of 67, and obviously the people under this brutal occupation have the right to be free of this occupation. Secondly, equality inside Israel, because, as I said, there is inherently inequality. There is the lack of equality, the lack of rights of minorities, and there is a system put in place to make sure that this is the case. So 20% of Israelis are non-Jewish, but when we say Israeli in Israel, we never count them. When we say Israelis, we mean the Jews. Also, if you remember, there was this struggle for social justice in Tel Aviv and around Israel a few years ago. And yes, they talked about social justice, they talked about housing and so on. But this was pretty much social justice for the privileged, rights for the privileged. So they didn't say any word about equality. They didn't say any word about the settlements in the West Bank. They didn't say a single word about the inflated military budget. Nothing that would be contentious. The only thing was, okay, people deserve rights, but obviously the rights that are being fought over are the rights of the privileged, the rights of those living in Tel Aviv, not those living in Jaffa, just a few meters away. So 20% are not counted, so these citizens of Israel, who are second-class citizens, deserve to be equal citizens. That is the second right. First right is the ending of the occupation of 1967. Second right is equality inside Israel proper. And the third and most important is the right of the refugees. 70% of all Palestinians are refugees. So even if we just look at the figures, they are the majority. And I cannot imagine any solution to the Zionist-Palestinian conflict without solving, not just diverting, but actually solving the issue of the refugees, which have been exiled since the very creation of the State of Israel. This campaign has become by now a worldwide awareness movement. And it is very encouraging, because what is happening is that if 10 years ago people were still talking about Israel as the only democracy in the Middle East, then a few years later they started questioning and they started talking about it as a democracy minus, a flawed democracy. And nowadays, even John Kerry referred to Israel, intentionally or unintentionally, about in the language that we should be addressing it, questioning whether it is a criminal apartheid state. Now, apartheid, sometimes misunderstood, doesn't necessarily refer to apartheid as was the case in South Africa, but it is a crime under international law. It is defined in the Rome Statute, and it seems as though Israel neatly falls under that legal definition of the crime of apartheid, and that is a very serious crime. That is one of the few crimes that fall under, that are defined as crimes against humanity. So that means that actually every single country in the world is obligated to fight against it, just like they're obligated to fight against genocide. Unfortunately, what happens is that, as we know, the countries, the governments, are doing the opposite. We know that the US, in its stated policy, in its stated foreign policy, they are against settlement construction. At the same time, when there was a UN vote about the legality of the settlements, they vetoed that vote. So they even go against their own stated foreign policy. And obviously the US funds Israel and arms it to its teeth and so on. Unfortunately, also the EU is very much complicit. One example we just heard of, and this is a very good example, the EU-Israel trade agreement, what's called the EU-Israel Association Agreement. There is a binding clause, Article 2 of the agreement clearly states that if there is a consistent human rights violation in Israel, then the whole agreement is void. It has to be frozen. It can be frozen, there can be corrective measures taking place like sanctioning, but what cannot happen is carrying on with business as usual with Israel. Unfortunately, what happens in practice is that every member state of the EU chooses to close its eyes and violate not only international law, but also its own legal documents, its own European law, in order to protect Israel. And that is absolutely unacceptable. If there are countries that claim to be neutral and wish to be neutral, rather than standing by the oppressed, if they choose to be neutral, that is their choice. But then they cannot lend legitimacy to, and definitely not be complicit with carrying on with these crimes. They can choose to be neutral. Unfortunately, while claiming to be neutral, they do something very different from that. And what the biggest campaign says is that Israel has to be treated just like any other country, no more and no less. That in itself will transform the whole situation. So, if Israel receives such impunity in the world, at the same time, we hear more and more of a public outcry from the people of the world. And as I mentioned, the whole discourse about Israel is changing, and that is a very, very promising sign, especially when we hear words like apartheid even coming from the White House. And I'm very happy to learn that the newly elected politicians may be even more critical of what is happening in the European arena, and I hope that they will also choose to take a stand and respect their own laws and their own agreements. Now, the discussion about Israel and boycotting Israel has also reached the Israeli society and the Israeli media. As you probably know, Israel has legislated a law against boycott, so there is an anti-BDS law which was legislated also in July 2011. And that law states that anyone boycotting the state of Israel, anyone encouraging the boycott for political purposes, is actually in violation of this law. Initially, it was supposed to be a very draconian law that violation supporting a boycott was supposed to be a criminal offense, and it was supposed to be retroactively put in place 1 year. So in theory, I could have been sued for something that I did a year before the law was actually legislated. They understood that that really doesn't look good in the eyes of the world, so they changed it a little. They softened it a little. But it is still illegal for me to call for boycott. I will probably not be put in jail, but they can sue me for a whole lot of money without even having to prove damages. One of the first organizations that reacted against this law was actually the Israel lobby in the States, AIPAC, because they understand how bad that makes Israel look. That goes against every value that we cherish, like freedom of expression, freedom of political organizing, and so on. But it just comes to show how desperate Israel is, how much they are concerned about the boycott, and not because this is harming the Israeli economy so much. Israel has a very strong economy, an economy that is very much based on trading with weapons, for example, selling of weapons, an economy that is based on the exploitation of Palestinians, and every aspect of Israeli society is profiting from the ongoing oppression of Palestinians. So peace is not that beneficial for Israel financially. But it has a very strong economy. So the boycott at the moment, even though the financial boycott is very important, that in itself wouldn't worry Israel so much. But other elements, like the cultural and academic boycott, really touch a nerve here. Because what we are saying in the Palestinian BDS call is a very responsible type of call. There are clear guidelines about what do we boycott and what do we not boycott. So we do not boycott Israelis simply because they are from Israel. We will boycott, however, those who are representatives of the criminal apartheid state. So for example, if you have an Israeli artist coming to perform in Amsterdam, they will not be boycotted because they're Israeli. Unfortunately, many of these artists or authors and so on, they come here being sponsored by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or participate in festivals which are organized by the Foreign Affairs Ministry or by the embassy and so on. And these festivals and these sponsorships are basically aimed in order to whitewash Israeli crimes, in order to divert the attention from the ongoing crimes to something that is more nice and fun and cultural and so on. And they are regarded as cultural ambassadors of the state. For that, they should be boycotted, regardless of their views, regardless of their identity, simply because they act as ambassadors for a criminal apartheid state. The same applies to academic boycott, by the way, because every academic institution in Israel is complicit in many ways. There are, for example, there are 2 campuses that have a military base on campus. And there is research funding coming from the Ministry of Defense. And there are courses given specifically to military personnel. And there are legal departments who take part in trying to legitimize all kinds of violations of international law and so on. So for that reason, every single Israeli academic institute is complicit in Israeli oppression. Therefore, what we are calling for is not for cutting of ties between academics. So the academic boycott is not going against academic freedom. What we're calling for is for the cutting of ties between academic institutions. We're calling for the institutions, academic universities, and so on in Amsterdam to cut their ties with the institutions in Tel Aviv and Haifa and Jerusalem and so on. So it is a very responsible type of call. And for that, that cultural and academic boycott, and hopefully also sports, we haven't had so much of that, but hopefully in the future, these really touch on the very essence of it. Because what we're saying is that those representatives of the state are illegitimate and should not be given legitimacy. It's not about what they think, it's not about how they perform, it's about them choosing to represent that state. And we see that that type of action really hits home, exactly, thank you. And also inside Israeli society, there is a lot of discussion about boycott. They don't like it, but they talk about it all the time. And it reaches mainstream media, it reaches all sorts of satire shows and so on. It reaches even the political campaigns. So whenever I am certain that in the next elections, the whole issue of boycott will be very central in the upcoming elections, whenever that will be. It did take part. It was part of the election campaign before, and that is a very reassuring sign. Even though Israel is a very strong state financially and so on, even though it has full impunity at the moment, we see these changes happening. And I will end here for now, simply saying that what we are offering is that instead of what Israel does is that it invests a lot of money, a lot of energy in trying to counter that BDS campaign, in order to convince the world that they are not actually in violation of international law and so on. And what we're saying is that basically all we demand is that such values as equality, freedom, and justice will be applied to all, will be applied to everyone. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Instead of maintaining this exclusive approach that this land is only for the Jews, Israel will have to transform, it will have to change its ways. And by doing that, by becoming a state, and call it by any name and whatever flag that they want to have, I don't care. And I don't also have much of an opinion about how many states there are going to be there. But in that land, rather than being based on exclusivity of that land, transforming it into a state that respects the rights of everybody, I don't think that is too much to ask for. But that is all that we need, basically. And the rest will follow.